Today's video will feature 3 cases that were incredibly cold, but they were solved in 2019. But before that, we want to bring you a word from our amazing sponsor, Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a fantastic documentary streaming service that was created by filmmakers. They have over 2,000 documentaries in genres like ancient history, nature, and my favorite, crime and mystery. A fascinating documentary I recently watched and really enjoyed was Art Trafficking, a Grey Market. This riveting documentary investigates the world's third largest black market, stolen antiquities. All the videos on Magellan TV are ad-free, and there are some stunning documentaries that are available in 4K. Magellan TV is also great because it's very accessible. You can watch on Amazon Fire TV, Google Play, Roku, Apple TV, and iOS, or simply cast from your phone to your TV. Magellan TV is offering criminally listed viewers a free month. Just go to magellantv.com/criminally listed and check it out for yourself. By checking out Magellan TV, you'll not only be able to learn more about the topics that you're already interested in, but you'll also be supporting Criminally Listed. Number 3. Anna Hlavka. In the summer of 1979, Anna Hlavka was 20 years old. She lived in an apartment in Portland, Oregon with her sister, Roseanne, and her boyfriend. Anna and her boyfriend had been talking about getting married. Anna and Roseanne both worked at a McDonald's not far from their apartment. On July 24th, 1979, they were both working. Anna finished her shift first, and she was seen outside of her apartment building at around 5 p.m. Roseanne finished her shift a few hours later, and she went home. She found her sister dead on her bed. Anna had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death with an electrical cord. The police had very little to go on. They couldn't find anyone who would have wanted to hurt Anna. The police interrogated people with a history of sex crimes who lived in the area. But nothing the police did led to any arrests. It wasn't long before the case became ice cold. As the decades went by, no progress was made on the case. In 2009, some detectives sent some evidence from the case to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. In 2011, about 32 years after the murder, the evidence was examined by Dr. Janelle Moore, a senior forensic scientist with the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. The evidence was amazingly well preserved. Dr. Moore found some DNA on the evidence, and she was able to create a full male profile. Creating a full profile on such an old case was a landmark for Dr. Moore. The profile was then entered into the FBI's combined DNA index system, which is better known as CODIS. They did not find a match to the DNA. The police then collected DNA from 8 different suspects and then compared their DNA to the DNA of the killer. Once again, they did not find a match. Then in April 2018, the Sheriff's Department in Sacramento County, California, announced that they had arrested the Golden State Killer. He was a 72-year-old man named Joseph James D'Angelo. D'Angelo was identified by a company called Parabon Nanolabs, who used a process called forensic genealogy. Parabon Nanolabs entered the Golden State Killer's DNA into a public DNA database called GEDmatch. They found a couple of his third cousins. Then they filled out the cousins' family trees until they found D'Angelo, who shared several attributes with the Golden State Killer. For example, he lived in the area where the Golden State Killer had hunted, he was the right age, and he had the same eye color. Once the sheriff's department had his name, deputies searched D'Angelo's garbage, and they found something that had his DNA on it. His DNA was compared to the Golden State Killer's DNA, and it was a match. After investigators in Portland heard about this technique, they sent Hlavka's killer's DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs. Then in January 2019, Parabon Nanolabs notified the police in Portland that they had found a match. The DNA belonged to a man named Jerry McFadden, who gave himself the nickname Animal. McFadden was never considered a suspect because he was a lifelong resident of Texas. Had his DNA not been found at Anna's crime scene, the police would never have known that McFadden had ever stepped foot out of Texas. The police in Texas were well acquainted with McFadden. McFadden was born in March 1948 in Haskell County, Texas. In April 1972, when McFadden was 24 years old, he was convicted of 2 counts of sexual assault, and he was sentenced to 15 years of prison. He ended up serving about 6 years. In June 1979, McFadden sexually assaulted an 18-year-old woman at knife point. Afterward, he strangled her. She survived the attack and reported it to the police. But McFadden wasn't arrested after the assault. Sometime after the attack, McFadden traveled to the West Coast with a woman. McFadden was in Portland on July 24, 1979, and he strangled Hlavka to death. By October 1979, McFadden was back in Texas. In 1981, he was arrested and convicted of the sexual assault that he committed in June 1979. He was given a cumulative life sentence. But in 1985, Texas prisons were overcrowded and a lot of prisoners were getting paroled. McFadden was one of them. On May 4, 1986, 18-year-old Regina Harrison and her friend, 20-year-old Gina Turner, went to Hawkins Lake Park in Hawkins, Texas, to meet 19-year-old Brian Boone. The trio did not return home that evening. Harrison's dead body was found the next day in a park about 30 miles away from Lake Hawkins. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with her underwear. 2 days later, Turner and Boone's bodies were found in a ditch near Ore City, Texas. Witnesses said that they saw the trio with a large man in the park. Another witness saw them in a pickup truck that was being driven by a man. McFadden, who lived in Ore City, quickly became a suspect because of his criminal record. He also drove a pickup truck that was similar to the one described by the witness. A couple talked to the police, and they said that on the same day that Harrison, Turner, and Boone were seen alive, they encountered McFadden at the same park where the trio met up. They said that McFadden pulled a gun on them and demanded their money. The couple told him that they didn't have any money, so he left them alone. About 2.5 weeks after the murders, McFadden was charged with the murder of Suzanne Harrison. He was not charged with the murders of Gina Turner and Brian Boone, but the police were sure that he had killed them as well. In July 1986, while he was awaiting trial, McFadden was being held in the Upshur County Jail. On July 9th, McFadden knocked out a sheriff's deputy inside the jail and stole his gun. McFadden then took the jailer's dispatcher, Rosalie Williams, hostage. At gunpoint, McFadden led Williams out of the jail and they got into her car. They drove the car until it overheated and then they had to abandon it. McFadden found an empty boxcar and they hid in there for a while. Then, after 28 hours of captivity, Williams managed to escape unharmed. Later that night, McFadden was found hiding in an abandoned house and he was taken into custody without incident. McFadden went to trial a year later in July 1987. There was no physical evidence that connected him to the murder of Suzanne Harrison. The most damning evidence against him was his previous criminal record. Many people, including a private investigator who worked on the case, thought that McFadden was innocent. The jury did not think that though. They deliberated for about 40 minutes and they found McFadden guilty. They sentenced McFadden to death. Jerry Animal McFadden was executed via lethal injection on October 4th, 1999 at the age of 51. He was executed before the state of Texas started collecting DNA samples from inmates. This is why his DNA profile was not in CODIS. Since McFadden was connected to Anna Hlavka's murder nearly 20 years after he was executed, it was clearly too late to charge him with any crime. But after 40 years, Anna's family and the investigators who worked on the case are happy that the case is finally closed. Number 2. Julia Woodward. On the evening of March 25, 1979, a man was riding a dirt bike in the desert just north of Reno, Nevada. He came across the decomposing remains of a woman. An autopsy was conducted, and the medical examiner determined that she had been killed by a devastating blow to the head. He thought that she had been dead for 7 to 10 days. There were bandages over her eyes. The police thought that the bandages worked as a blindfold, and she was led out into the desert where she was struck in the head. One of her shoes was missing, as was her underwear. Her ID was also missing, so the police were not able to identify her. At first, there was speculation that she was 23-year-old Linda Taylor. Taylor, who worked as a bartender in Reno, went missing weeks earlier on March 6, 1979. But the police were able to determine that the remains weren't Taylor's. Months went by and the young woman was not identified. Then on November 2, 1979, about 7 months after the woman's body was found, 2 men were doing some hunting just north of Reno. They were about a mile from where the body was found. They came across the skeletonized remains of a woman. She too had died from a blow to the head. 5 days after the second set of remains were found, the police announced that they had identified one of the sets of remains. The body that was found 7 months earlier, in March 1979, was 20-year-old Julia Woodward. About a month before her body was found, Woodward had moved out of her family's home in San Rafael, California. She had planned to start a new life in South Lake Tahoe, California. South Lake Tahoe is about 60 miles south of Reno. However, no one is really sure if Woodward settled in South Lake Tahoe or if she moved somewhere else after leaving San Rafael. 2 days after Woodward's remains were identified, the second set of remains were identified. She was 17-year-old Jeannie Smith, who lived in Reno. Her parents reported her missing a year and a half earlier. The police assumed she had run away. The police strongly believe that the murders were committed by the same person. Both were young women with similar physical features, and at some point, they had both worked as waitresses. They were both killed within a year of each other, and their remains were found a mile apart. They were both blindfolded with bandages, led into the desert, and killed by a blow to the head. Also, both only had one shoe, and their underwear was missing. The police had several persons of interest, but no one was ever arrested. The cases eventually became cold. When DNA testing became more prevalent, evidence from Julia Woodward's crime scene was tested for DNA. But the tests were inconclusive. In 2019, the evidence was tested again using more advanced technology. This time, they found enough DNA to make a profile. The profile was then entered into CODIS, and it was matched to a man named Charles Gary Sullivan. In August 2018, when the match was made, Sullivan was 73 years old, and he was living in Prescott, Arizona. Sullivan's DNA was in the system because of a crime he committed in September 2007 in Nevada County, California. He had picked up a 25-year-old woman who was hitchhiking. He told her about a vein of turquoise in the area, and he offered to show it to her. She accepted the offer, and he drove to an isolated area. They got out of the van, and as they were walking, Sullivan pulled out a gun and held it to the woman's head. He then bound her wrists and ankles with zip ties. Sullivan had forgotten something in his van, so he went back to the van to get it, leaving the woman alone. The woman had a pocket knife on her, and she used it to cut the bindings on her ankles. She then ran and found help. Sullivan was arrested shortly afterward. He was convicted of false imprisonment, and he was sentenced to 3 years and 8 months in prison. Before Sullivan lived in California and Arizona, he had lived in Reno, Nevada. It turned out that Sullivan knew 17-year-old Jeannie Smith, who was killed in March 1978. The last friend or family who saw Jeannie alive said that Jeannie was planning on going to buy some drugs from a guy named Chuck. Charles Sullivan was also a person of interest in the March 1979 disappearance of 23-year-old Linda Taylor. Shortly after Taylor went missing, Sullivan was interviewed by the police, and he said that he and Taylor had dated for a while. He claimed he didn't know what happened to her. At the time of this video, Linda Taylor has not been found. After Sullivan moved away from Reno, he worked as an auto dealer. He also got married. In August 2018, when Sullivan's DNA was linked to Julia Woodward's murder, he was still married. He was arrested on August 18, 2018, 40 years after Julia Woodward's murder. Sullivan's wife said she believes her husband is innocent and she plans to support him. Sullivan has only been charged with Woodward's murder because DNA connects him to the crime scene. The police also think that he killed Linda Taylor and Jeannie Smith, but they do not have any evidence that he committed either murder. The authorities also think that Sullivan killed other women in Nevada in the 1970s, and they aren't the only ones who think that. Some of Sullivan's family members also think they killed other women. So far, Sullivan has claimed he is innocent, and he says he is not a serial killer. Number 1. Regina Harrison. In the spring of 1983, Regina Harrison of Dania Beach, Florida, was 19 years old. At the end of April 1983, she had just finished her third year at Palm Beach Atlantic University in West Palm Beach, Florida. When she was done school for the year, she moved back to her family's home in Dania Beach. On the evening of May 2nd, 1983, Harrison set off from her family's home on her bike. She was heading to the boardwalk in the neighboring city of Hollywood, Florida. Both Hollywood and Dania Beach are in Woodward County. Sadly, Harrison did not make it home that night. Her nude, dead body was found in some woods in Hollywood the next day. The medical examiner determined that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The murder completely baffled the police. In the 2 months after the murder, they had interviewed 40 friends and relatives of Harrison's, and no one could think of anyone who would have wanted to hurt her. Some people told the local newspaper that she was the nicest person you could ever meet. A woman got in contact with the police, and she said she saw Harrison on the boardwalk on the night that she was killed. The witness said she was talking to a man, and then they rode off on their 10-speed bikes together. The witness talked to a police sketch artist, and it resulted in this sketch. The sketch led to a lot of tips, but those tips did not lead to any arrests. A few months after the murder, in July 1983, a detective in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, was watching TV. He saw Crime Stoppers' reenactment of Harrison's murder. He thought that the killer may have been a man they had arrested a few months earlier, 23-year-old Ronald Henry Stewart. Stewart had been arrested a few weeks earlier while he was trying to break into a home. In custody, Stewart confessed to committing 9 sexual assaults in Fort Lauderdale. Stewart had just moved to Fort Lauderdale in March 1983, about 3 months before he was arrested. Stewart said that he would break into first-floor apartments where single women lived alone. He would grab a knife from the kitchen, and then he would sexually assault the woman at knife point. Afterward, he would rob them. Less than 3 months after Stewart was arrested, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of sexual battery, and he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Because he pleaded guilty to the 3 counts, he was not charged with the other 6 sexual assaults he confessed to. The Fort Lauderdale detective decided to get in touch with the Broward County Sheriff's Office, and he told them about Stewart. Deputies then showed a photograph of Stewart to the witness who saw Harrison with the man on the bike. She said that he was the man she saw with Harrison that night. Then, a man who had been in jail with Stewart told the authorities that Stewart had confessed to killing Harrison. So in March 1984, Stewart was charged with Harrison's murder. This was only part of Stewart's legal problems. Besides the 3 50-year sentences he received in Florida, he was now facing 5 charges of sexual assault in Gulfport, Mississippi. Before Stewart had moved to Fort Lauderdale in March 1983, he had lived in Gulfport, Mississippi. After Stewart was arrested in Fort Lauderdale, the police in Gulfport thought that he was responsible for 5 unsolved sexual assaults in their city. Stewart ended up being convicted of the 5 sexual assaults in Gulfport, and he was given 5 50-year sentences. When it came to the murder of Regina Harrison, if Stewart went to trial and he was found guilty, he could have been looking at the death penalty. The case against him was not strong. The witness's identification and the jailhouse informant's testimony were the only evidence against him. There was no physical evidence that connected him to the crime. In fact, his fingerprints did not match any prints that were found on Harrison's possessions. Stewart decided to plead guilty, and he received yet another 50-year sentence. Stewart was allowed to serve all his 50-year sentences concurrently. He served most of his time in Mississippi. Then in February 2007, he was handed off to the state of Florida, who kept him incarcerated. On September 11, 2008, 48-year-old Ronald Henry Stewart died in prison from cancer. 10 years later, in November 2018, the Sheriff's Office in Broward County received a 4-page letter. The woman who sent the letter was the sister of Jack Harold Jones. Jones had a disturbing criminal record. On June 6, 1995, Jones went into an accounting office in the small town of Bald Knob, Arkansas. In the office, he found 34-year-old Mary Phillips and her 11-year-old daughter, Lacey. Mary was supposed to take Lacey to the dentist. Unfortunately, they never made it there. Jones had attacked the mother and daughter. He tied Lacey to a chair, and then he took her mother into the break room. Jones sexually assaulted Mary and then strangled her to death with a cord from a coffee maker. Jones then strangled Lacey. After she lost consciousness, he hit her 8 times in the head with a BB gun. When Mary and Lacey did not come home that evening, the police were alerted and they went to the accounting office. They found Mary and Lacey. Investigators started to photograph the crime scene, and then suddenly, Lacey regained consciousness. She would go on to survive the brutal attack. At the hospital, Lacey was able to describe the man who attacked her and her mother. She specifically remembered that the man had a teardrop tattoo near his eye. The local police immediately suspected that she was talking about Jack Harold Jones. Jones had never been in any serious trouble, but he had committed some petty crimes. Also, at the time, Bald Knob only had about 2,600 residents, so a guy with a teardrop tattoo on his face stood out a bit. Jones was brought into custody, and he confessed to committing the attack. He was subsequently sentenced to death. Then in March 2003, about 7 years after he was sentenced to death, the Broward County Sheriff's Office charged Jones with another murder that happened in June 1991. Lorraine Barrett was 32 years old, and she lived in Bridgeville, Pennsylvania, where she worked as a customer service representative for a telephone company. On June 1, 1991, she arrived at Fort Lauderdale, Florida for a vacation. 5 hours after she arrived, she was found dead in her motel room. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. In 2002, 11 years after Barrett's murder, the case was reopened and evidence from the crime scene was examined for DNA. Some DNA was found and it was entered into CODIS. It was then matched to Jack Harold Jones. In 2005, Jones pleaded guilty to Barrett's murder and he was given a life sentence. But Jones stayed on death row in Arkansas. In the spring of 2018, state officials in Arkansas found out that the supply of one of the drugs that they used to execute prisoners was going to expire at the end of April. They decided not to waste the drugs, and they would execute 8 death row inmates. Many people thought that this was controversial because the state of Arkansas had not executed anyone in 13 years. They ended up executing 4 of the 8 men. One of the 4 men was Jack Harold Jones. Before Jones was executed, he apologized to Mary Phillips' daughter, Lacey, for attacking her and killing her mother. 52-year-old Jack Harold Jones was pronounced dead just after 7 p.m. on April 24, 2018. It turned out that sometime in 2006 or 2007, Jones wrote a 4-page letter and gave it to his sister. He made her promise not to open it until 1 year after his death. In the letter, Jones confesses to a murder. He does not name the victim. He describes riding bikes with a young woman on the boardwalk. He wrote that they rode into the park, and that's where it happened. He wrote that he saw the newspaper article about the murder, which contained a sketch of the person seen with the victim. Jones did not think that the sketch looked like him. Jones wrote that he wanted to confess because his victim's spirit had haunted him. He wrote, "She haunted me for 3 years, and we made peace. She moved on. She was really mad at first, missed her parents. But she learned things over there that helped her, and she got to understand who I was and why I had done such a thing. She forgave me. I never forgave myself." He also wanted to confess because he wanted the victim's family to know that he was sorry. He wrote, "So, you let them know that I am deeply sorry, that I couldn't rest easy until they knew the truth. Let them know that in the end, I became a better person, and I did the best I could to be as much as I could for others, out of respect for the ones I've harmed." After reading the letter, the detective thought that the description of the murder and the victim sounded a lot like the murder of Regina Harrison. He had the evidence from her crime scene sent for forensic testing. Male DNA was found. In February 2018, the Sheriff's Department in Broward County learned that the DNA belonged to Jack Harold Jones. Ronald Henry Stewart was exonerated of murder. However, because of Stewart's 8 other 50-year sentences, he was going to die in prison whether he was convicted of murder or not. Regina Harrison's family was less than thrilled by the news. Her brother told the newspaper, the Sun-Sentinel, "You hear people talk about closure all the time. I can understand it. Having been through it, closure is really overrated. It's important to know what happened. It's important to know that justice was done. But on a practical level, it doesn't matter. The fact that Stewart didn't kill my sister doesn't make him any less evil or any less dead." Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/criminallylisted. Also, please go to criminallylist.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.